I was spurred to do this quick comparison video of soldering iron tips after seeing questions in the YouTube comments from people wondering why their tips get pitted or wear away with what seems like increasing frequency or a short time span, and why it is that solder just doesn't seem to adhere to the tip sufficiently to get a good heat transfer bond to the item or material or terminal or component lead being soldered. So here's a brief explanation of what might be occurring here. First of all, soldering iron tips are supposed to be made primarily of copper, because copper is a very efficient heat conductor, and when you apply the tip to a surface being soldered, it will very quickly heat the joint, as long as you apply just a little bit of solder and that becomes your wetting factor to spread the heat to the rest of it. Unfortunately, copper will be worn away very quickly, eaten into and pitted by the fluxes in rosin core, lead solder, and especially by lead-free solder, which uses more corrosive fluxes and operates at a higher melting temperature. Soldering iron tips are normally plated with iron at the very tip. Let's see if you can see it. Usually on better quality tips, you will see a very slight difference in the color of the tip, which, depending on the quality of the tip, might just have been a little bit of solder applied at the factory. But ideally, it's supposed to be a coating of iron. And the tip itself should be of a slightly different material or plating. The reason for this is that, as I said, the copper is easily worn away by solder. It actually dissolves and melts into the solder, especially with the high temperatures of lead-free soldering, and because of the fluxes used. And the lead-free fluxes are particularly corrosive. So the problem I've encountered is that most cheap tips that are included with your soldering station or that you buy as replacements online are not necessarily made of copper. They might be iron plated at the tip, but they're made of some other material, hopefully not iron throughout. So let's see what happens when we apply a magnet to these cheap tips. 3 of these here came with a cheap soldering station from Harbor Freight. First of all, I'll mention that they're the wrong shape. They're pointed, conical, and this is very poor in most cases for soldering. I really prefer using what is known as a chisel tip. It's kind of a blunted, rounded off chisel, but it's more efficient generally for heat transfer in most cases, unless you're soldering something really tiny, although you can get chisel tips that are pretty small. Now watch what happens when I apply the magnet from this flashlight to these cheap tips. They'll stick right to the magnet. These are also cheap tips that I bought from somewhere online, or one might have been included with a Milwaukee battery-powered soldering station. And you'll notice that this one's pretty strongly magnetized. This one came from elsewhere. The only part of it that's magnetic is the very tip. See the difference? And if I try this, nothing. So again, we've got some cheap tips over here like this one, that one, same, okay, same. So all of these tips here are highly magnetic, not just at the tip end, which I would expect because they're supposed to be iron plated, but on the backside and throughout the body of the tip. As they go rolling every which way, but I think you get the general drift. The better quality tips that are presumably copper, maybe with some chrome plating, that's why they're shiny, and iron at the very tip are more like this. Barely attracted, easily shaken off the magnet. And you can only really pick them up by the iron plating on the tip. Iron's not as good a conductor of heat as copper, so you may have more difficulty heating up your solder connection if you're using a tip of that poor quality. Plus, it may dissolve and pit more quickly and easily. Now, even these old, new old stock, probably Weller soldering gun tips have no attraction to speak of at the back end where they attach to the gun, but the iron plating on the front end allows them to be attracted to the magnet. Now, there is one exception to non-magnetic tips being of better quality, and that would be tips such as Weller used on some of their old, I think they called them PTC, positive temperature coefficient soldering irons and tips. These actually have a magnet at the end. You'll notice there's a number stamped, and the number corresponds to the temperature of the tip. And there's a little magnetic relay in the handle that holds these, and they work on the principle that the magnet was designed to lose its magnetic force at a certain temperature. So as the tip of the tip heats up and cools down, it will activate and disconnect sequentially a little magnetic relay or magnetic switch, like a reed switch, built into the handle. So these are supposed to be somewhat magnetic. Let me see if they'll stick to these. Stick to these. Not enough magnetic force to stick to something like that. But obviously, they'll stick to a magnet because the end of the tip is magnetic. You'll also notice that these, being high-quality tips, are plated for the better part of a quarter inch of the tip with iron. And of course, the tips themselves are magnetic. But this is a special purpose for an older style of soldering gun. Soldering iron that Weller put out like 40 or 50 years ago. I still have one that I need to repair. I think the switches, the magnetic switches screwing up contacts might be oxidized. So anyway, this is an example of what happens if you have crummy soldering tips acquired from who knows where. This is an example of a crummy soldering tip with more of a conical point. And like I said, they're not very good, you know. And these are tips of better quality that really have almost no attraction to the magnet except from the iron-plated tip. So check your tips and see what material they're made of. And next time, consider buying soldering accessories from more reliable electronics-oriented sources than Fleabay or Temu or Alibaba or some such.